They told the world the Queen's will was locked away, sealed forever from public eyes. But what Catherine stumbled upon inside a hidden palace drawer wasn't just a document. It was a betrayal that would shake the monarchy to its very core. The palace had always claimed that Her Majesty's final wishes were beyond tampering, guarded by tradition, law, and unbreakable loyalty. Yet, there in her hands, Catherine found something that shattered every illusion she had ever held about the sanctity of the crown's legacy. It began innocently enough, an afternoon walk through corridors she had come to know as intimately as her own childhood home. Balmoral's air hung heavy with memory, its silence echoing with the footsteps of a monarch now gone. Catherine's hand brushed against the edge of an old desk, a relic from another era, its drawers stiff with age. When she pulled one open, her breath caught. Inside lay an envelope, its wax seal faintly cracked, the royal crest still visible yet strangely smeared, as though someone had tried to preserve it after breaking it. At first, Catherine assumed it was an overlooked piece of correspondence, a relic that had slipped past archivists. But as she slid the papers out, her world changed. The dates struck her first. They didn't match. The will's original preparation had been widely known among certain circles, whispered quietly by courtiers and advisors who had long since retired. But these pages bore newer marks, edits, replacements, suspiciously clean lines that clashed against the aged parchment. Catherine's pulse quickened as she traced her eyes over sentences abruptly cut off, references removed, and entire sections missing. This wasn't a simple copy. This was something reassembled, carefully reworked, yet imperfectly disguised. Her heart raced as she turned the pages, and that's when she saw its subtle but unmistakable additions written in a hand that was not the Queen's, phrases that bent the voice of a woman who had always been precise, deliberate, almost regal in her language. This tone felt different. It felt imposed. Catherine shivered as the realization crept in like ice. This was not the untouched truth of Queen Elizabeth's farewell. This was something rewritten. And then the name surfaced, not boldly, but slipped between paragraphs, where only the sharpest eye could detect it. Camilla. It wasn't an explicit signature, yet it was enough. Small changes, subtle insertions, the kind of fingerprints left behind when someone wanted power to stretch further than it was ever meant to go. Catherine's lips parted, her breath sharp. Every instinct told her she was holding evidence of betrayal. A betrayal that reached beyond protocol or inheritance into the heart of legacy itself. Disbelief clouded her mind at first. How could this be possible? How could something as sacred as the Queen's will, sealed away by law and loyalty, be compromised? She thought of William, of George, of Charlotte and Louis, and a surge of fear pressed against her chest. What else had been stolen? What had been erased? Each line she read seemed to strip away another layer of her trust in the institution she had sworn to uphold. The horror settled in slowly, twisting like a blade. This was no clerical error, no innocent mistake. This was deliberate, and it carried Camilla's shadow. For years, Catherine had sensed the tension, the quiet battle for influence, the unseen lines drawn between them, but never had she imagined that the final words of the Queen could be reshaped to serve another's ambition. It was one thing to win over Charles, to charm the public, to seize a crown against all odds. It was another to tamper with the dying wishes of a monarch who had defined an era. Catherine pressed the papers back into the envelope, her hands trembling. Her face burned with disbelief, and yet her eyes refused to let go of the truth staring back at her. She felt as though she were standing at the edge of a chasm, staring down into something far darker than she had ever been prepared to face. Because if this will had been altered, then the monarchy itself was at stake. The Queen's voice had been silenced, and in its place, Camilla's ambition now whispered through the words. But if Catherine thought the discovery was shocking, what she uncovered next revealed Camilla's scheme was deeper and more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. For decades, Camilla played the long game, but what Catherine discovered suggested she hadn't just influenced Charles, she had rewritten history itself. From the very beginning, Camilla's story had been one of persistence, patience, and ruthless determination. She had once been cast as the woman in the shadows, dismissed as an outsider, the figure who would never belong within the gilded walls of monarchy. And yet, against all odds, she climbed from scorn to respectability, and from respectability to a crown. Her rise was not sudden, nor was it accidental. It was meticulous, built piece by piece, a steady dismantling of obstacles until nothing stood in her way. Catherine had always sensed the quiet rivalry, the unspoken contest between herself and Camilla. It wasn't a rivalry born of open hostility, but of something colder. Two women tethered to the same institution, both representing different visions of the monarchy. Catherine embodied youth, modernity, and Diana's enduring memory. Camilla represented survival, experience, and the will to redefine the rules that had once kept her out. For years, they had exchanged polite smiles in public. Yet behind palace doors, the silence between them was loaded, every look carrying the weight of unspoken competition. It was during private dinners, away from the public eye, that Catherine first noticed subtle hints of what lay beneath. Conversations carefully steered toward inheritance, toward heirlooms, toward the question of who would hold what power when the inevitable came. Catherine remembered how Camilla would linger on such topics, her voice laced with curiosity, her questions delivered with casual indifference that always felt too rehearsed. At the time, Catherine brushed it aside as idle speculation. But now, holding the altered will in her hands, those dinners returned to her with new meaning. The alterations Catherine uncovered weren't small technicalities. They were sweeping, deliberate erasures of promises the Queen had intended for William and their children. Items of immense symbolic value, jewels, heirlooms, artifacts that carried not just monetary worth, but the very weight of history, were reassigned. Some vanished. Altogether, their destinations erased or redirected into vague phrasing that offered no clarity. Catherine felt the blood drain from her face as she realized these changes weren't random. They were carefully orchestrated to strip her and her children of their rightful inheritance. It was as if someone had taken a knife to the Queen's words and carved away the future meant for the next generation. The more she thought about it, the more the pieces began to fit. Catherine recalled the sudden shifts in royal protocol that had followed the Queen's passing, subtle adjustments in ceremony, unexplained delays in the passing down of certain traditions, the quiet removal of references to Diana's legacy. At first, she had assumed it was the natural course of transition, a monarchy shifting into a new era under Charles. But now, she saw the truth. It had been preparation. Quiet groundwork laid to ensure Camilla's influence reached further than the crown itself, embedding her presence into the very marrow of royal heritage. And that was the heart of Catherine's dread. It wasn't simply about titles or jewels or wealth. It was about Diana. Every alteration in the will seemed to push Diana further into obscurity, her memory dismantled, her legacy fractured. Camilla's reach wasn't satisfied with her own coronation. She sought to sever the bloodline ties that kept Diana alive in the hearts of the public through William and Catherine's children. Catherine's pulse quickened as the chilling suspicion grew. Camilla wasn't just trying to secure her place, she wanted to erase Diana's, and through Catherine, bury what remained of her spirit within the monarchy. And yet, Catherine's nightmare was only beginning. The altered will contained names and exclusions that pointed to an even more devastating betrayal. The Queen's will was supposed to honor Diana's memory. Instead, Catherine found evidence that someone had tried to erase her completely. For years, Catherine had believed that Her Majesty intended to protect the connection between Diana and William's children, ensuring that the jewels, letters, and sacred heirlooms of the late Princess of Wales would live on through them. It was not simply a matter of wealth or status. It was about preserving the spirit of a woman whose presence still lingered in every public memory and every private wound. But as Catherine turned the altered pages of the will, what she saw sent a chill through her heart. Those heirlooms were gone, redirected, reassigned, not to William, not to George, Charlotte, or Louis, but toward Camilla's bloodline. The devastation struck her like a cruel blow. To Catherine, these were not just objects. They were lifelines to a woman who had endured unimaginable pain under the same crown Catherine now bore. They were promises whispered in the shadows of grief that Diana's children would inherit not just jewels, but justice, recognition, and respect. And yet, here it was, undone in ink. The emeralds Diana had once worn, the tiaras she had carried with pride, even letters that had been carefully preserved, altered, shifted into the hands of those who had no claim, no bond, no right. Catherine felt her throat tighten as her mind raced to George and Charlotte. What would it mean for them to grow up in a world where even Diana's memory was stripped away from them? The weight of it all pressed heavier when she recalled William's own words, spoken in private moments when the world wasn't watching. He had told her, with a mixture of pride and anguish, that his greatest duty was to protect his mother's memory, that no matter how the monarchy tried to move on, Diana must never be erased. Catherine remembered the intensity in his eyes when he said it, the vow that came from a son who had lived through tragedy no child should endure. To discover now that the very foundation of that promise was being dismantled filled her with both sorrow and rage. It was not just theft. It was a rewriting of history. The eerie symbolism struck her. Diana's jewels, once the emblem of resilience, compassion, and rebellion, now reassigned to Camilla's grandchildren. It was as if the past itself was being handed over to a bloodline Diana had once stood in opposition to. Each word Catherine read felt like a knife cutting deeper, as though the will itself mocked the woman whose presence still haunted the monarchy. In the silence of her chambers, Catherine made a vow of her own. She would not allow Diana to be erased. She would not let her children be robbed of their rightful inheritance, not of jewels or titles, but of truth. This battle was no longer about paper or signatures. It was about legacy, memory, and survival. And Catherine knew in that moment that she was not just fighting for her children. She was fighting for Diana's spirit itself. But if Diana's legacy was being targeted, Catherine soon realized the Queen's will had also been twisted to pit family against family. When Catherine traced the altered sections, one shocking truth leapt off the page. Princess Anne and Prince Edward, once pillars of loyalty, had been quietly written out. Their names, once embedded firmly in the Queen's final instructions, were no longer there. Entire passages had been crossed through with chilling precision, their legacies erased as though they had never existed in her intentions. For Catherine, this revelation was like stepping into a nightmare that deepened with every line she read. This was not merely tampering, it was a calculated erasure. The Queen's children, her most steadfast supporters, were being deliberately sidelined, and Catherine could feel the cold shadow of manipulation pressing against her every thought. The implications were staggering. Anne, the Princess Royal, had been the embodiment of loyalty and duty, the one who never faltered, never sought attention, but always upheld the Queen's values. Edward, quiet yet dependable, had carried out his role with unwavering commitment. For both to be diminished, their presence crossed out and rewritten into silence, suggested something far more sinister than an error. It suggested intent. It suggested a hand that had sought not only to redirect wealth and heirlooms, but to reshape the power of the family itself. And in Catherine's mind, there was only one name that fit behind such a move: Camilla. It became clear that this was about more than jewels or inheritance, it was about control. By weakening Charles's siblings, Camilla's influence grew unchecked. Anne, with her sharp tongue and fearless resolve, would never have allowed such quiet alterations to stand. Edward, though less outspoken, represented a stabilizing force, a balance that Camilla might have wanted to remove. Catherine's hands shook as she realized what this meant. Camilla had sought to centralize power in a way that ensured her dynasty, not the Queen's, would dominate the monarchy's future. Horror welled inside Catherine as the scale of the betrayal came into focus. This wasn't confined to her or to Diana's legacy. This was an attack on the very structure of the royal family itself. If Anne and Edward could be so easily discarded, who else had been betrayed? Could Andrew's name appear twisted, or Charles's wishes themselves rewritten to mask Camilla's ambition? Catherine could no longer tell where the Queen's words ended and Camilla's began, and the uncertainty tore at her resolve. The thought of her children growing up in a monarchy redefined by lies left her almost breathless. The ripple effect of these revelations began to seep into her mind. By removing Anne and Edward, Camilla had effectively weakened the bonds of loyalty within the royal house. Catherine and William were left isolated, with fewer allies to stand against the creeping dominance of a woman whose ambition now stretched far beyond the crown. The family was no longer united under the Queen's guiding hand. It was fractured, vulnerable, and prey to manipulation. Catherine's stomach churned as she understood the truth. This wasn't just a will. This was a blueprint, carefully redrawn to build Camilla's dynasty from the ashes of the Queen's intentions. And then came the most chilling twist. The name that should never have appeared in the Queen's sacred will yet somehow did. Catherine's hands trembled as she read it. Among the heirs of Windsor appeared names no one expected. Camilla's grandchildren. For a moment, she thought her eyes were deceiving her. That exhaustion or shock had blurred the ink on the page, but no. There it was in black and white names that had no rightful claim, no royal blood, inserted into the sacred will of the Queen herself. The Queen, who had spent her entire reign safeguarding the bloodline, upholding centuries of tradition, ensuring that the line of succession was never tainted by interference. To see those names written, there was not only scandalous, it was a violation of everything the monarchy was meant to protect. The weight of this discovery crushed Catherine's chest. The Queen had always been strict when it came to bloodline succession. Every heir, every jewel, every estate was tied not just to individuals, but to the continuity of the crown. Yet here, laid bare in the altered will, was the opposite. This wasn't devotion to the monarchy's sacred order. This was an infiltration designed to plant Camilla's descendants in a history that had never belonged to them. Catherine felt her throat close with disbelief. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't an oversight. It was intent. The truth was undeniable. This was Camilla's endgame. All the whispers, all the subtle maneuvers, all the quiet conversations about inheritance Catherine had brushed aside over the years suddenly aligned. Camilla had not just fought for her own crown. She had fought for permanence. And permanence meant embedding her family's name, her grandchildren's legacy, into the heart of the monarchy itself. If the alteration stood unchallenged, Camilla's dynasty would not fade when her reign ended. It would live on, anchored by stolen words written into a queen's will. Catherine's mind spiraled into grief and fury as she pictured George, Charlotte, and Louis, their future overshadowed by outsiders placed above them in the very hierarchy meant to secure their birthright. She thought of George, still so young, unaware of the battles being waged around his future, and of Charlotte, whose connection to Diana was already under threat. She thought of Louis, the child who might grow up never understanding the theft that had stolen what was his by right. The image left Catherine sickened. She could not imagine telling her children that their grandmother's words had been twisted to favor those with no rightful claim. When she showed William, the silence between them spoke louder than any words. He stared at the document, his jaw tightening, his eyes dark with a fury Catherine had rarely seen in him. He didn't shout, but his breathing told her enough. William had lived his whole life protecting Diana's legacy, carrying the burden of her memory, and now even his mother's lineage was under assault. His fury wasn't only at Camilla, it was at the realization that the monarchy itself had been hijacked, that his own family had become pawns in someone else's scheme for power. It was betrayal on a scale neither of them could have imagined. A betrayal not only of their children, but of the Queen herself, whose true wishes had been suffocated beneath the ambitions of another. Every word on those altered pages felt like a dagger, not just to Catherine and William, but to the very soul of the monarchy. But Catherine knew if this truth came out, it wouldn't just destroy Camilla, it could tear the monarchy apart. When Catherine showed William the altered will, silence fell. Then his rage erupted like thunder across Balmoral's ancient halls. For a moment, he couldn't speak, his eyes fixed on the pages that had once carried the final wishes of his grandmother. He turned each sheet slowly, his face tightening, his breathing sharp and uneven, as disbelief hardened into fury. The betrayal was almost too much to process. This wasn't just manipulation. It was theft, a desecration of the Queen's word, and an attack on his children's future. William's fists clenched as the reality of what he was reading sank in. His entire body seemed to tremble with the weight of the truth. His stepmother had dared to rewrite history itself. His fury boiled over not in words, but in a vow that he carried within himself like a storm. His children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, would never be robbed of their rightful legacy. Whatever Camilla had tried to inscribe into the Queen's will, William would fight it. He swore that their inheritance, not of wealth but of dignity, of heritage, of their mother's and grandmother's love, would remain untouched. His voice finally broke the silence, low and sharp. "I won't let her take what is theirs." It was not a statement. It was a promise. Yet in that moment of fire, Catherine stood at his side and forced him to confront the impossible choice before them. She feared what would follow if they exposed the truth too soon. Their duty to the crown bound them in silence, yet their duty to their children demanded action. Their eyes met across the room, filled with both resolve and despair. The confrontation was not between enemies, but between two souls torn apart by the burden of survival. Catherine begged him to think of the scandal, of the chaos that would engulf them if this knowledge slipped into the world. The monarchy was already fragile, teetering under suspicion and change. If this alteration became public, its credibility would collapse. But William's fury made him restless, unable to accept silence as the answer. He paced, consumed by the weight of his responsibility. The palace had always demanded sacrifice, yet here it asked too much. It asked for the silence of a son who could see his mother's memory being desecrated. Diana's ghost seemed to hover in every corner, her name lingering unspoken but unavoidable. Would she have wanted them to stay silent? Would she have begged them to expose the truth, no matter the cost? The question gnawed at him, haunting his every thought. The rage that coursed through William's veins wasn't only for his children, or even for the Queen. It was for Diana. He saw her face in his mind. The pain she endured, the injustice she suffered, and now this final insult, her memory buried beneath Camilla's ambition. It was the bitter realization that his stepmother had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Whatever fragile peace existed between them was gone. Camilla had shattered it forever. But while William burned with fury, Catherine braced for the storm because Camilla had already begun moving to cover her tracks. The moment Catherine uncovered the truth, Camilla seemed to sense it, and she was ready to strike first. It was as though an invisible alarm had gone off the second Catherine touched those papers, warning Camilla that her secrets were no longer safe. Suddenly, the atmosphere within the palace shifted. Moves were made not with fanfare or open confrontation, but with precision, as if every step had been planned long before Catherine ever set eyes on the altered will. What appeared to be ordinary changes in staff and scheduling began to form a pattern so deliberate it could not be ignored. Within weeks, key aides who had long been close to the Queen were abruptly retired or reassigned. Those who had witnessed the original drafting of the will, those who might have recognized what had been altered, were swept quietly out of their posts. Some were given generous packages to ensure their silence. Others simply vanished from the inner circles without explanation. To the outside world, it looked like a natural transition, but to Catherine, it was unmistakable. Witnesses were being erased one by one, leaving her more alone with each passing day. While this purge of loyal staff unfolded, Camilla launched a very different campaign in the public eye. Smiling, gracious, playing the part of the supportive consort, she filled her days with public engagements, her presence woven into headlines about stability and unity. Behind closed doors, however, she tightened her grip on Charles, pressing him with the authority of someone who had weathered storms far greater than suspicion. Catherine could feel Camilla's shadow lengthen over every conversation at court, her influence seeping into decisions that once would have been balanced by Anne or Edward, now conveniently absent from the Queen's rewritten will. Even more insidious were the whispers being carefully seeded about Catherine herself. A narrative began to emerge, quietly but effectively, that she was under immense strain, that grief had made her fragile, and that her judgment could not be trusted. Subtle but poisonous, the idea was planted that Catherine was overly emotional, perhaps even paranoid, and that any claim she made should be treated with sympathy rather than seriousness. It was a cruel strategy, designed to isolate her further, to make her appear like a woman unraveling rather than one uncovering the greatest betrayal of their time. Then came the rumors, deliberately leaked to the press, each one twisting the narrative before Catherine could even open her mouth. Talk of discord, of Catherine being at odds with tradition, of imagined rifts between her and other members of the family, each story carefully sculpted to discredit her. She could feel the walls closing in, not through open attack, but through whispers and headlines that chipped away at her credibility. It was a silent war, and Camilla was winning without lifting her voice. The terrifying sense grew inside Catherine that she was being cornered in her own palace. Every move watched, every word weighed, every ally stripped from her side. What had begun as shock over the altered will was now transforming into a battle for survival within the very institution she had devoted herself to. Her hands had uncovered betrayal, but her voice was being smothered before she could speak it aloud. But just when it seemed Catherine would be silenced forever, fate handed her an unexpected ally. Catherine thought she was alone, until Princess Anne walked into her chambers with a truth of her own. For days, Catherine had carried the unbearable weight of discovery in silence, feeling the walls close in as Camilla tightened her grip and erased any chance of resistance. But the quiet knock at her door, followed by Anne's unflinching stare, changed everything. Anne had always been regarded as the most disciplined of the Queen's children, the one who endured without complaint, who placed duty above all else. Yet the words she spoke that evening shattered the isolation Catherine had been drowning in. She too had noticed her exclusion from the Queen's legacy, and she wasn't about to remain silent. Anne's voice was steady, stripped of theatrics, but heavy with meaning. She revealed that she had seen the signs long before Catherine stumbled upon the altered will. Anne knew that her name, once firmly present in the Queen's plans, had been erased. She admitted that she had held her tongue, watching as the balance of power shifted, but the unease within her had grown too strong to ignore. It was confirmation that Catherine was not imagining things, not succumbing to paranoia, but confronting a betrayal both women now recognized as real. For the first time since she uncovered the documents, Catherine felt something she had nearly lost in solidarity. That solidarity deepened as Anne shared words that made Catherine's heart pound with renewed fire. Before her passing, the Queen had spoken directly to Anne, confiding her intentions for the family's future. She had made clear her desire to see Diana's legacy preserved, her heirlooms passed to William's children, and the bonds of family maintained with dignity. Nothing the Queen had said aligned with what was written in the altered will. The contrast was stark. Catherine realized she now had something even more powerful than a forged document. She had testimony, the living memory of the Queen's own words, entrusted to the daughter she trusted most. The weight of that realization coursed through Catherine like a surge of strength. For days, she had wondered if she would be forced to remain silent, trapped in Camilla's shadow, condemned to watch her children grow under a monarchy reshaped by deceit. But now, with Anne's confirmation, she had proof. The Queen's true intentions were not lost. They had simply been silenced. And together, Catherine and Anne could make sure they were heard again. A resolve began to take root between them, quiet but unshakable. They could not allow Camilla's forgery to stand unchallenged. This was no longer a matter of personal loss, but of justice for the Queen, whose legacy had been twisted for another's ambition. The monarchy itself was at stake, its very soul, threatened by lies, and it would take both of them to fight back. Catherine looked at Anne not as a sister-in-law, but as an ally in a battle neither of them had chosen. Yet both were destined to fight. The air seemed to shift as their alliance solidified. Two women, often cast in the background of royal life, now stood at the heart of a struggle that would decide the future of the crown. Their determination burned quietly, but fiercely, against the darkness Camilla had unleashed. And with Anne by her side, Catherine prepared to confront the final storm, the moment of truth that would decide the monarchy's future. It all came down to this: Catherine, William, and Anne against Camilla, in a confrontation that would shatter the palace's silence. The days of whispered suspicions, of hidden papers, and unspoken truths had reached their breaking point. No more denials, no more shadows. Everything was about to be laid bare. In a hushed room within the palace walls, three stood united, fueled by grief and betrayal, while one clung desperately to the empire of deceit she had built. The Queen's will was no longer just a document. It was the battlefield. Camilla entered, with defiance in her eyes, but beneath it, Catherine saw flickers of unease. Still, the queen consort carried herself with the confidence of someone who had manipulated the narrative for years. When the accusations were first laid at her feet, she scoffed, her voice sharp and dismissive. She denied everything, insisting. The documents Catherine held were misinterpreted, the words twisted by grief and imagination. Yet, the cracks in her composure began to show as Anne, unshaken, produced her memory of the Queen's own spoken wishes testimony that contradicted every alteration Camilla had defended. The fury on Camilla's face betrayed her. She had not expected resistance this strong, nor proof this undeniable. It was William who broke the restraint of silence, his voice rising with a thunder that echoed his mother's ghost. He accused her not just of tampering, but of desecrating Diana's memory. Every jewel stolen, every heirloom reassigned, was not merely a theft of inheritance, but an assault on the legacy of a woman who could no longer defend herself. His words struck like a sword, piercing through the thin veil of excuses Camilla tried to wrap herself in. He demanded to know how she could justify rewriting the Queen's will, how she could dare to think her own bloodline had any place in the sacred lineage of Windsor. Anne, unflinching, followed with iron resolve. She spoke not as a daughter betrayed, but as a custodian of truth. She recounted the Queen's private words, promises made in confidence, moments when her mother had spoken with clarity about what should be passed on and to whom. No forgery could erase that. No alteration could diminish the Queen's intent, as it had been spoken aloud to her most loyal child. Her voice was steel, unwavering, crushing any lingering illusions Camilla tried to maintain. And then Catherine rose, for the final stand. Her voice trembled, not with weakness, but with the weight of a mother's determination. She declared she would never allow her children to be robbed not of jewels, not of titles, but of the truth. She spoke of Diana's legacy, of the Queen's rightful intentions, and of the future that was being stolen by deceit. It was a declaration not only against Camilla, but against every shadow that had tried to silence her. At that moment, she was not merely a consort. She was a protector, a warrior for her family's rightful place in history. When her words ended, the room fell into a silence so sharp it seemed to cut the air. Camilla's fury drained into something colder, realization. She could see it in their eyes, the unshakable unity of three who would not bend. Her web of control had unraveled, and no denial could weave it back together. She had been exposed. But even as Camilla's scheme collapsed, the scars of betrayal would remain forever marking the monarchy with a shadow it could never fully escape. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.